In 1920, John B. Watson, a renowned psychologist, and Rosalie Rayner, his assistant and eventual wife, decided to combine love, science, and a fair bit of cluelessness in an experiment that will go down in history as the Little Albert experiment. The idea was bold and execution debatable, and the result as ethical, murky as a midsummer and mud pudding. Talks in a story one might mistake for the beginning of a DE and epic Little Albert's fate was sealed. So today on Memory Lane, hide your kids from the Little Albert experiment. But before things get too far, make sure you have subscribed to Memory Lane channel. After that, leave us a comment and let us know what other psychological study you want to hear about. Now, what's the worst for guys named Albert? Meeting J. Robert, Oppenheimer, or the following experiment? John B. Watson, perhaps inspired by Ivan Pavlov's famed experiment with salivating dogs and ringing bells, thought he would take the idea of conditioned response in a different direction. Why condition hunger when you could condition terror? And why test on a dog when you could traumatize a child instead? Apparently, he felt Pavlov just had not gone far enough. The goal was as clear as it was questionable: to condition fear in a small child and see what happened, ideally without getting anyone hurt. The test subject was a 9-month-old baby nicknamed Albert. The setup was straightforward. Little Albert was introduced to a series of innocuous white furry objects, most notably a rat. As Albert reached towards the furry creature, Watson struck a metal bar with a hammer right behind the infant. The baby was predictably startled and uncertain as to what had happened. This process was repeated until Albert began to connect white furry objects with a loud, frightening noise, causing him to react with terror at the mere sight of anything that had both fur and a bright hue. The test was technically a success. Little Albert, once blissfully unaware of the terrifying aspect of rabbits, cotton balls, or Santa Claus marks, was now properly conditioned to find anything white and fluffy as terrifying as anyone's worst fear. Watson kept observing Albert's newly acquired phobia, apparently oblivious to the ethical quagmire into which he was sinking. To call the experiment unscientific would be like calling a volcano a bit warm. Ideally, scientific experiments which include parameters like objective measures, control groups, and a simple size larger than one terrified infant. At last, Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner skipped past all that, embracing instead a style of personal observation that feels strangely like guesswork. There were no precise metrics, no scales, and no control group of other babies with which to compare their results. In short, Little Albert's fear was only being measured against itself. When Watson recorded his findings, he was thrilled to note that the conditioning had worked. Albert was visibly upset by white furry things, which was enough proof for Watson to declare victory. Yet, to any budding researcher, the celebration would have seemed a bit premature. Experiments are always more than the initial hypothesis. They are the culmination of elimination and repeated effort. What if Albert was just having a bad day? What if he was already predisposed to dislike the color white? What if the testing environment itself was having a greater effect on Albert's reaction than the sudden loud noise? Watson's report did not answer any of those questions, instead opting for a summary approach to his findings that drew questionable conclusions based on very thin evidence. After concluding that Albert was thoroughly conditioned to loathe all things white and fluffy, Watson and Rayner just kind of stopped. They ended the experiment, making no effort to reverse the conditioning, assuming that Albert's color-based terror would simply wear off over time, much like the tests themselves. This assumption was not based on any scientific evidence. Little Albert's mother reportedly packed up and fled town, presumably afraid that Watson would hunt them down for another experiment, like mad scientists tend to do. Watson's parting words suggested that Albert would simply grow out of his fears after experiencing some of life's rough and tumble. This sentiment is perhaps better suited to things like skinned knees or stolen lunch money, but at least he made an attempt to be the version of reassuring. In any case, Albert was gone, the experiment was done, and Watson's controversial experiments would be filed away in the great catalogue of scientific missteps. During his experimentation, Watson waxed poetic about the exemplary health of little Albert, one of the best developed youngsters ever brought to the hospital. Watson noted in his 1920 paper, citing the boy's unflappable demeanor as proof of his ability for the experiment, but it wasn't long before scholars began to poke holes in Watson's rosy description. Some suggest Albert may have had developmental delays or neurologistic issues, raising a massive red flag that would impact the results of any test. Obviously, this possibility is something a reputable researcher would have eliminated before beginning any experiments, but reputable and John B. Watson have rarely occupied occupied the same sentence. Watson wasn't around to address this allegation, and what's more, he burned all his notes on the experiment before his death, like what mad scientists tend to do. It was a dark time for child welfare and research. There was no such thing as informed consent. If you took part in an experiment, you just had to trust that the researchers weren't lying to you about what they were doing. It wasn't until decades later that psychology, spurred by stories like Little Albert, began to seriously consider the ethical implications of involving infants in this type of study. Psychologists across the world eventually agreed that babies are, in fact, terrible test subjects for fear conditioning. A child just beginning to make associations at that stage and is unable to articulate any kind of complex thought. So placing one in a behavioral conditioning study has little scientific value. The only thing Watson was accomplishing with his experiment was scaring the hell out of a random baby. The American Psychological Association would eventually instate guidelines aimed specifically at keeping babies and other participants from being subjected to terror for the sake of science, presumably hoping to never encounter any case like Albert again. Sorry, Bill NY, sometimes science doesn't rule. Due to Watson's meticulous and quiet literal attempt to burn all bridges behind him, Little Albert's true identity remains as shadowy as a Bigfoot sighting, but there are theories. Some researchers believe Albert was Douglas Merritt, a child with hydrophiles who tragically died young. This, of course, only added fuel to the ethical dumpster fire. What if Watson had knowingly traumatized a terminally ill child? If he had known, we would have no doubt he would have addressed such a gross ethical oversight by saying, what can you do? In 2014, a group of Canadian researchers suggested another possibility. Little Albert may have been William Albert Badger, a man who lived in his 80s and most notably had a lifelong fear of dogs, no matter the color or their coat. Although this has not be completely verified, the stories diverge, the mysteries multiply, and the scientific community remains split over which Albert, if either, was really the unfortunate child in the Watson experiment. It's also possible that nobody wants to claim Little Albert as their child because nobody wants to be seen as the parent who signed their baby over to Dr. John and the pot banger. But there are no records of Albert's folks, so it's unlikely we'll never know the full circumstances of what led them to subject their baby to Watson experiment. Regardless of the details, one fact stands clear: Watson's legacy endures, if only in the cautionary tale to psychological students. In the wake of the Little Albert aerial legacy, psychology went through something of an existential crisis. What did it mean to be a science? Was anything permissible in the pursuit of knowledge? The academic world slowly agreed that ethics mattered and that perhaps children should not be subjected to frightening experiments for posterity's sake. Modern researchers now known to avoid traumatizing infants as much as possible and to find less potentially harmful ways to conduct conditional experiments. Furthermore, Watson's notorious endeavor inspired the creation of the APA's Code of Ethics, which, despite not being formally established in 1953, effectively did away with the Wild West approach to science favored by Watson and many others. Rather than confirming Watson theories, the Little Albert experiments demonstrated the need for ethical research standards, regulations, and reliable methodologies in scientific study. We may never know for sure who Albert was, but his story had a permanent effect on the entire world. Dr. John B. Watson, meanwhile, left psychology behind for a successful career as an advertising executive like a mad scientist would. So what do you think? Was the Little Albert experiment justified? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our channel.